Testing, testing.
How are you? Good, how are you doing? I'm going to announce before we start, that we're not going past 8 o'clock. Zach?
Did I hear we have a limit? You the man.
Well, you know, the thing is, some shit we can kick around for hours. Hey, Craig, where are we picking up?
So my notes say that we left off at number 21. Yes. And 21 is a real, it's like a nothing.
That's a, oh yeah,
We're really starting on 22.
and that's a doozy. Okay, guys. The work session of the Cape City Planning Board is now in session, and in compliance with the Open Public Meetings Act of 1975, adequate notice of this meeting has been provided. Should any member of this board have reason to believe this meeting is being held in violation of this act, they shall so state at this time. Hearing none, we will start with the Pledge of Allegiance. I'm going to get this right this time, Karen. November 12th minutes?
Would you like roll
I'm
call?
sorry, roll call.
Okay, thank you. Happy Thanksgiving.
Gotcha.
Mr. Becerra,
Yes.
Mr. Jones,
Here.
Mr. Riggs,
Here.
Mr. Crowley, Mr. Gorgone,
Here.
Mayor Mullick,
Here.
Councilmember Yeager,
Here.
Mrs. Reed,
Here.
Mr. Lundholm,
Here.
Mr. Bedusis,
Here.
Mr. Crippen.
Here.
Thank you.
Okay, then we have the minutes of November 12th. Any corrections to the minutes? Motion to adopt?
I'll make a motion.
Thank you, Mayor.
I'll second.
Mrs. Reed motions, Councilmember Yeager seconds. Mr. Gorgone? Mayor Mullick?
Yes.
Councilmember Yeager?
Wait, I think I have to abstain.
Okay,
Was I here?
Still make the motion.
okay. Mrs. Reed?
Yes.
Mr. Crowley? Mr. Lundholm?
Abstain?
Mr. Riggs?
Yes.
Mr. Jones?
Yes?
Mr. Becerra?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, tonight's meeting is just going to continue the discussion on the master plan, on the land use elements. Before we start, we got a TV time limit of 8 o'clock. Remember that when they had the wrestling? Yeah. Years ago, TV time limit. All right, so Craig, I'll let you pick up where we left off, and
Okay, so I'm continuing on with my review, whoops, sorry. Continuing on with my review memo dated October 15th, 2024. I hope everyone has that. My notes indicate we stopped at number 20, so I'm going to pick up with number 21. So there was a recommendation to re-examine and address the standards for all the commercial districts, and that was because there was a lot of uses that just weren't listed, and that's based on the definitions. I believe that the recommendations I made earlier with regards to the definitions for the commercial uses addresses that, so I think we can move on to number 22, if everyone is okay with that.
sounds good.
Okay. Now, 22 recommends that we comprehensively re-examine and address the standards for the C1 district, which is essentially the Washington Street Mall primary business district. So availability of off-street parking in this area is extremely lacking, and the ability to develop new parking is problematic due to land availability. Availability of workforce housing has also been cited as a concern. This area is pedestrian-friendly and complementary to apartments over commercial uses, which are permitted currently. Ability to convert unused areas above commercial uses has been curtailed by lack of parking, relaxing or eliminating the parking requirement for apartment uses in this district should be investigated. So that's the recommendation that's in the master plan reexamination. Based on that, I made a recommendation that we revise Section 525-22C 1A, which is essentially how our parking calculations are made. And if you skip to page 13 of 16 at the top, we have apartments over commercial uses, and this is an addition. So we don't have any standards for that, but typically it falls to the residential site improvement standards. And I echo that in my recommendation. So I'll just read it into the record. Apartments over commercial uses shall provide parking in accordance with the residential site improvement standards requirements. In the C1 district, no off-street parking shall be required for apartments over commercial uses. So that's the big one. This is probably an item of discussion. I'm essentially saying that there should be no parking requirement for apartments over commercial uses in that district to facilitate developing workforce housing. Now, I haven't done this in a while, but workforce housing is different than affordable housing. Affordable housing is a state-defined, very COA restricted. You can't really control who's in there or anything like that. It's often deed restricted. It's always deed restricted. Workforce housing is a little different. It's your day-to-day workers, your seasonal workers, your J6 workers, those type of workers that could be there. It's an affordable housing stock that doesn't meet the affordable housing requirements.
So how come you weren't specific to the exemption? I mean, would it be a good idea, and it's a lot more palatable if the exemption applied only to apartments above commercial buildings that were for affordable housing?
No, workforce.
Workforce housing, excuse me, yeah.
We don't define workforce housing. So we would have to come up with a definition of workforce housing.
Okay.
Yeah, because how would you control it not being,
That's the other issue.
You're probably going to have a hard time controlling. I mean, if you've got workforce housing, it doesn't mean that it can't be market rate housing, that, you know, that determination. I also have to remember, the C1 zone encompasses more than just the mall. It goes over to Lafayette Street, it goes to the Acme, it goes down Washington Street past Victorian Towers. So we're not just, don't just focus on the mall, because unless we want to do overlays with the mall and other areas. So it's not an easy thing to tackle.
It also assumes that who's ever in the workforce housing doesn't have a car.
That's probably not an unfair characterization.
Unless you restrict those housing units to people who are in the workforce, you don't know who's in that property.
That was what I was just saying.
Yeah.
You can't, it's hard to
Right.
make that distinguishment between that and market rate.
Right, unless you want to recommend it's restricted to employees of some business in town.
Well, I don't know how you're going to do that. The
I-
other
I'm
thing-
not
the other
suggesting
thing
that
is-
either.
The other thing too is that, you know, we need housing for young families. We need affordable housing, and not COA type thing, but somehow, and I don't know how you.
Middle-income housing,
Pro-
young
Yeah,
middle-income.
but how do you legislate that? You just relax some of the standards? I'm not even sure you can relax the standards enough.
I don't think you want to legislate it. I think you want to believe that this type of housing that we're providing is the type that are going to be used by people that don't necessarily have an automobile, are more pedestrian friendly. They're utilizing pedestrian-friendly transportation as opposed to, obviously, they're not going to be able to park in that C1 business district. The parking is just not there.
Unless we start talking about a parking garage, it gives us some more. And there's only one, well, there's two logical spaces for that. Next to Collier's and then the lot down at the end of Bank Street.
Well, if
It's
this-
a big,
if-
it's
if-
all intertwined, and it's not an easy solve.
And the other part of the master plan does recommend at least a discussion of a parking garage.
Yes, it
It
does.
has for years.
I know people are, they don't want to see a big parking garage, but if I may just add that I came from up North Jersey, a town called Rahway, where the main hub for the transit trains into New York City stopped. And they have a parking garage there. You go right by it, you don't even know it's a
No,
parking
yeah.
garage.
Same thing down in, it's the same thing down in Charlotte and Savannah. There's one in the middle of town in Savannah. if you-
St. Augustine,
St. Augustine.
Annapolis,
Westchester.
Princeton.
Now, but that's really a council decision to do a parking garage. We can recommend it, but they've got to make the call, they got to pay for it. And, there's a lot of things you can do with a parking garage. You can condo them out and sell spaces to the businesses or to houses in the area that don't have parking. So there's market forces that could come into play that might work out, but the city's the one that controls the majority of that space.
Mr. Chairman, just a quick question. The apartments that are above the mall that exist today, are they illegal? Are they, were they
No,
each
you
individually
probably
granted
have-
something?
Most of the apartments are legal, but you've
Okay.
got a lot of space above some of the stores that are not apartments.
Okay.
That could be turned into a.
That was my,
or
that was my question. When you say above the first floor, you could have 2 and 3 floors of
You
this.
could. just-
Most of
just
them are
two above
3.
it.
Well, 2 above, yeah.
Two above it. But, and a lot of them all only has two stories to begin with. So we're talking about encouraging 3-story buildings. Of course, then you've got fire escapes, and there's other elements that have to be brought into play, but it just makes sense, because right in the middle of town, that's where all the stores are, that's where the employees need to be.
I don't hear much discussion against this
No.
amongst this board right now.
I would just like to add something if I could. If personally, and I don't know if this is lawyering or just being a member of the town, if you allow there to be created a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment anywhere near the mall, I don't think it's going to be used for workforce housing. I think it's going to be an Airbnb. I mean, I just don't think that people are going to take 2 and 3 bedroom apartments that they can get, $600 a night for and use it for employees. I also don't think that you should be providing for workforce housing without defining the term and setting up a permitting system for it. I mean, I have the Alcott down the street from me, which is allegedly workforce housing, and, it's an economic downturn away from being a boarding house. So I don't understand how that works. I don't know if that's a hotel or what exactly that is. It's fine now. I mean, Mr. Bashaw runs a nice operation. His employees are mostly neat and polite over there. But it's not, you can't legislate based on personalities or how that one person operates. So I don't know what workforce housing means from a zoning perspective.
Well, it's something that obviously, everybody seems to be in favor of the concept, but the devil's in the details. And maybe we could have a couple people that would like to volunteer to work on the side and put some ideas forward.
Mr. Chairman, just to fully understand the existing, I'm not naming any existing, okay? The ones that are, when I read this, is that meaning that the ones that exist provide parking?
It means that generally they've all gotten variances.
They've
Correct.
gone through the variance
Nobody-
process and
nobody
received?
provide- Nobody, or their grandfathers, one of the two.
Okay. The reason I'm asking that obviously is to see how it exists today, because we know there's apartments there. I assume that they're all,
Well, I mean, the
done
ones over at Dulles
correctly.
have been there forever.
Right.
And as an example,
If
I'll name names.
you think that it would turn like Airbnb disaster there, what would be, if, say we allowed this, and then we started to realize that there were a lot of Airbnbs, what could we do then?
Can't you tie, couldn't you have a scheme, a legislative scheme where in order to get your, what's that called?
Mercantile
Your
license.
permit, your mercantile license to operate that commercial rental or commercial operation for workforce housing, you have to demonstrate the person is an employee, you have to provide a,
So then I don't,
W-2 or
then I don't see that being a real problem. We can do that.
no, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying I wouldn't zone for workforce housing until you have that system in place so that you really are going to make sure that it's for workforce housing. Because when you do these kinds of things in one commercial environment or one economic environment, you have to think 20, 30 years ahead. And things right now seem that way, but I mean, things go up and down. And I'm worried that you're going to create a bunch of boarding houses and have no control over who's in there and no definition of what workforce housing means. So if you're really going to do it, I would create a scheme where it's tied to a mercantile license. There's a verification. The person certifies they don't have a vehicle, and then they can have an apartment that is workforce housing.
Is that a council level requirement, or is it something we can do?
I don't think it's something that you can do. I think you have to do it, you have to do
In
it
conjunction,
together.
right.
You know, I mean, I think that would be a concerted effort to define workforce housing and have a system in place. And then once you have that, then you can really take advantage of it. You could have whole buildings that are workforce housing buildings, and they go through that system, and
Mr. Chairman, I just, again, back to how it exists. There are currently buildings that are three-story buildings that are only used on the first floor, and then the second and third are basically storage or whatever. I mean,
But with the obvious ones, were the old Barry's Close building,
right.
which is a big building. I don't know if everybody knows where that is, but that's on the corner of Jackson and Washington. And it's got 3 floors. It's got the 2 stores on the first floor, and there was 3 floors above it. They used to have a tailor up there years ago.
It does seem like a waste of space when
It
you
does,
are not using the second and third floor on.
Is there any sense on how many apartments that are used as apartments as opposed to storage there? And when someone has the business and owns that building or whatever, excuse me, isn't it licensed or, they have a permitted use? They may not be using the second floor in accordance with the permitted use though, but what's the count that we're talking about? By the way, I'm in favor of doing away with the parking criteria there, but is any sense of the numbers here?
No, but you have to assume the worst-case scenario, because anyone, even if they had commercial on the first and second floor, they could do away with the second floor.
Yeah.
I mean, the definition is apartments over commercial uses, so there just has to be commercial use on the bottom floor, and then everything above can be commercial. Can be apartments.
Yeah.
Sorry, I said that wrong.
You're asking for a quantification of how many there are now?
Yeah.
Can I remind you of the Bogle Brothers application where they must have gotten a variance for parking to construct a more than one-story building on the mall? And then they came back to get approval for apartments because the board had only allowed them to use it for storage. And then the board required it to be not a manager working year-round. It had to be a J1 or a summer employee. I don't know how code enforcement would handle that, but that is what the board did. I don't know if you made a deed restriction or not.
No.
Do you guys remember that?
It wasn't deed restricted. I mean, when the Bogles built that property, it was the parking lot for the bank on the corner. Those two stores.
So the assumption underlying all of this is that the reason these apartments aren't already developed, the reason these spaces aren't already developed as apartments is because they think they can't comply with parking?
That's,
I mean, I can't imagine that's the case. If someone thought that they could have livable space above those units, I've never seen the board turn down a parking variance for space above a place on the mall. I mean, so is that the presumption that if not for this parking restriction, all of these things up there would be developed?
It's possible. It's possible.
Well, some of these bigger, older buildings, to convert that second and third and fourth floor living is probably a major renovation to meet code.
It is.
And it might, and then you're going to tell them you have to make it workforce affordable housing. They're going to say it's not worth it.
That was my question.
Right.
Unless you come up with a way of incentivizing
I mean, you're still gonna renovate the building, there's gotta be egresses, and, you know, there's not a big stairwell in the middle of Barry Close for egress and fire escapes, and
Case that was denied.
Yeah, I don't,
Well, no, they were adding 10 rooms upstairs and had nowhere to drop people off for a hotel. That's different than a place on the mall. I mean, that was a totally different scenario. That's not,
Same district, though, it's a C1.
but they don't have any dead space unused up there, do they?
no, yeah, Taco Pablito?
Do they have,
Oh, they got 3 floors above it.
that's nothing.
Restaurant
Actually,
and
there used to be, there's a
two
restaurant on the 2nd floor.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
I mean,
a
I've done
bar on the second
Two,
floor.
2 floors above that, 2 floors above that.
I'm saying that could be an illustration of what
That's
could
not,
happen.
that's not in the C1 zone, though.
I think that's C2,
Right.
C1,
C2.
that's
Yeah.
C2 there. But we made the same recommendation for the C2, but that's another discussion. That area is a little different than the mall, the primary business.
I mean, I don't know that we don't kind of take a leap of faith, and then as things occur, we make adjustments along the way.
Once the horses have.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to Rich's point, and if we don't lay the groundwork for what this thing is before we start changing our codes to accommodate it, we're going to be in for a problem, I think. We need to define in code what workforce housing is, and then change our code to accommodate that.
I just want to clarify, my comments weren't so much at the mall. I mean, there's only so much that can happen
No,
there.
you-
There's only so many possibilities. I'm talking just in general, workforce housing and trying
We
to,
had-
So am I.
There's 3 recommendations for workforce
mall's
housing.
fine. I don't
Right.
One is in the C1, one is in the C2, and the other one's more global for the rest of the city.
Right.
So like, this is a focal topic that needs to be addressed. So we certainly need to address workforce housing and define it.
There has to be a definition of workforce housing that other municipalities are using, right? We may not, but other,
Yeah, I'll research it and try and find one, but
Well, but like Rich said, if this is done in conjunction with council making some provisions, that there's got to be proof that who's going to be there, that's the way, that's sort of the way to control it. I mean, you could make it like a dormitory where you got 4 rooms and they all share a kitchen. Just as an example. I mean, I don't think that we want to do that, but that's one way of saying, well, it's just, you're not going to get, you know.
You know, just more general than what we're talking about, but just maybe a bit obvious, but even since the last master plan development, I think, at least I felt like, look, workforce housing is not such a big problem in Cape May. You can go over the bridge, and within 10 minutes, you're in North Cape May, you're in portions of Lower Township that there is affordable housing. Yeah, you're going to have to drive in and drive out.
Not anymore.
That, as we all know, that's so changed even in the last 3 to 4 years, where affordable workforce housing, I think, really does become a Cape May problem, because we don't have 10 minutes over the bridge anymore.
It's a county problem.
It's a county problem. So, but I mean, I'm, for this board, I'm saying, you can no longer say you have that affordable family housing 10 minutes away. Is that really a big deal? Go over the bridge and, you know, you're in and out of town pretty quick. Now, we don't have that luxury yet. So I do think you have to look at what you can do creatively to, I mean, look, we're going to have problems getting lifeguards and police officers and firefighters. I mean, you know.
There is, in the business community, it makes sense to the business community to rent places and make sure that they can keep their employees.
Yeah.
Then,
Employee doesn't work for them, they're not going to stay.
That was what I was thinking with Rick's comment, which makes all the sense in the world. Does someone actually want to invest that kind of money? The answer may be if they want to stay in business and have employees.
Right.
and I think there also should be a conversation between the council and maybe this board with the business community and the people who employ these folks. What are their needs? Are they assessing their needs properly? Do we know exactly how much impact workforce housing could have on Cape May? And the folks who need to sit around a table are the businesses who employ these people. before we go any further, it has to be a comprehensive look at this thing from a council level.
Just so we're clear, though, I wasn't so much talking about the mall. I don't mean to put the kibosh on the mall thing.
No,
I mean, I do think there'll be, some of them may be Airbnbs. I mean, look at the Peter Shields thing upstairs is a high-end hotel above the storefront. I mean, they didn't make that workforce housing there. You rent like a room for the Peter Shields above the, whatever that thing's called, diagonal from Finn. I mean, that became a hotel above it, so,
But that's not, there's an apartment up there.
no, you rent that through Peter Shields.
You do, but it's not
It's not
rooms.
workforce housing.
It's not workforce
I promise.
housing. No, it is not.
So, I mean, that's what I'm saying. I'm just not sure that the nice upper end of these buildings are going to be workforce housing, but I also don't think requiring parking in the malls is silly. I mean, it's just, there's nowhere to park there even if you require it. You know, it's an impossibility. It's like the same thing on the boardwalk. I mean, so I wasn't talking about that. I'm talking about in the more general part of that, Craig's report, workforce housing.
can I comment about parking? Yeah.
Something-
I guess not, right?
No, you're done.
Every time.
The only, not the only problem, but the biggest problem in Cape May is parking. We have codes that require parking from every resident, every business. This proposal strikes me as the first step in a surrender to the insolvability of that parking problem. If you do it for one sector of your residential housing stock or commercial stock, you're going to do it for another. There's going to be no justification for not doing it. And sooner or later, you're going to just dismantle all of our parking requirements, which is a shame because there are opportunities for the city. One of them is the Parking Trust Fund to create a revenue stream that would solve the problem of parking, or at least mitigate the problem of parking. I think taking a step like this it sends a signal that we're not going to be ever really seriously talking about parking.
Well, Dennis, I get that, except that unless you're doing a parking garage, you're not going to mitigate the parking issue. By charging people money and putting it in a fund with no sense or purpose of where you're going to use that money is a money grab.
I absolutely agree with you. I absolutely agree with you.
Solve something, so.
Yeah, well, the parking garage is one good solution to it. Another one is a more comprehensive shuttle system that needs to be worked out. The point is, if you start saying, well, this sector of our stock doesn't have to have parking requirements, then the next sector is going to come to you and say, well, why not us too? And you're going to basically begin pulling threads out of the thing that could be the solution to the Cape May's problem, and you're basically saying, we can't solve it, we don't even want to try. So let's pull apart our parking
Well,
requirements.
some spots just are not
I don't
practical. It
necessarily-
just can't happen.
Yeah,
really-
and the point is, you either have to provide an off-street parking space, or you have to provide the city with the resources to get that car someplace that you can't get it. That's the responsibility of the property owner.
The hook for this town is the mall. The hook for this town is, one of the hooks is the mall. And if you can't satisfy those people on the mall, that I just think we ought to try this thing in baby steps. If it doesn't work, we try something different.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's because of this it's gonna expand elsewhere. I don't think that at all.
We have restaurants on the beach right now who were supposed to have 40 parking spaces. They have none. And it's not just the mall that causes this problem. It's going to be everywhere, and it is everywhere. And the more commercial.
Those are existing buildings. They weren't built recently with no parking. They've been there forever. I can't think of a restaurant on the beachfront that's been built that was allowed not to have any parking.
Oh, Primal.
Primal?
It's not practical, though. Where you gonna park? You can't, there's nowhere to
See,
park.
Primal, I
Yeah,
don't know, was that this?
let
board?
me say it again. I'm not
Primal
saying,
reduced an amusement
Right.
use that I think generated as much or more parking in that space than Primal did. So it was a net zero kind of thing.
yeah, but let me say it
wasn't
again.
empty space, it was part of the arcade.
I'm not necessarily arguing for on-site or off-street parking because our code requires it. What I'm saying is that the individual property owner who creates the need for parking that he cannot meet either off-site or in some other way, needs to be held accountable for the impact that that decision has on the city's parking problem.
Dennis, there are people who've received variances, and they paid for the fees and everything to get variances.
That's fine,
for parking.
that's fine.
So you can't go back to them and say, by the way, you're not complying, we're going to start charging you money. That's
No,
not
the building's
right.
gonna be
That's
empty.
not right.
That's a
It's
possibility.
not, that's, not my life, it's not. That's.
It's a possibility. I bring it up as a
What
point
about,
of
what about the
discussion.
houses, what about all the single houses that don't have parking, that pre-exist, when the horses were here?
And what about the
start charging them?
the Sleeps 26 houses built in Poverty Beach that impact by bringing 10 and 12 cars to the property?
They meet the parking requirement. They don't.
No, they don't meet.
They do meet the ordinance requirement, Dennis. It doesn't mean that they don't have more cars than they're supposed to, but everybody in town, when you have guests at your house.
Off-street
When
parking?
you have guests in your house, are you exceeding your parking?
No, I have parking, thank you.
But but if you have more than the 3 spaces behind your house, or whatever, it's 4 spaces.
As a matter of fact, I do, but you can send an inspector out to make sure you count.
What I'm saying is, if anybody who has guests, you're gonna start charging them because they have people for the night that are parking in the
Well,
street.
see, what you're doing is you're gainsaying what I'm trying to say. And in the process, you are basically shutting,
Gainsaying?
yeah, it means contradicting.
Yes.
In the process, you're suggesting that we really don't need to really put our minds together on the parking problem.
I'm saying we don't need to penalize people financially because they don't have parking, which is what you're trying to capitalize on.
No, I'm trying to open a dialogue on what we can do to solve our parking problems. That's what I'm doing.
Mr. Chairman, you originally recommended maybe putting together a task force or whatever in regards to affordable housing.
Right.
I think that makes sense. I mean, maybe have a small group present some thoughts to the board, or I don't know what you think, Mr. King.
I think for the mall, I think you guys should decide that.
Okay.
For the mall. But in general, in terms of like your workforce housing plan and how you're going to implement it, that's something that you should have some people from the committee, some people from this board kind of get together and think about it. But for the mall stuff that I think is the first element, I think you guys can decide that and come up with a plan
Well, keep
here.
in mind, the C1 district, C1 district is more than the mall.
I understand, but
But you can do an overlay of just the mall properties that would be exempted from the parking requirements, if that's.
I'd like to
I
give,
mean, we thought there was an overlay of the mall. I didn't
There's
know that.
not, there's not.
I thought the mall was, that there was some separate part.
I'd like to give Craig a shot at just finding the definitions for workforce. I'm not so sure that I don't think it's something that we need, everybody's got to put their head together, because there's got to be other towns that have already done this for us. And we can just take the best one we think is right.
Mr. Chairman, I believe that we should table this issue until we get a true definition of what we're looking for. For workforce.
Do you have to use the term workforce? Because if you think about who's going to be staying there, they're either staying there for a season, or they're staying there.
Well, that's why we need the definition.
But then you don't have to call it workforce, okay? I mean.
We're going to keep going around and around until we actually have a definition of what it is. I have another comment, though. You know, I live in the city, as many of you know, and what our mayor stated is so true. And what I see happening is that our workforce is parking a half a mile away, and then getting scooters out of their cars and using scooters to get to work, or they're getting bicycles out of their car and using bicycles for that last half mile or 1 mile in order to get to work. The space above the commercial businesses in the mall should be utilized. Whether they want to put the money into it or not, it's up to them, but it should be utilized. With a special mercantile license, I believe that the landlord and the business owner would work together to ensure that it is a working force employee that is using the premises and renting the premises. And then they would also have to sign some type of document or whatever if they have a car, if they don't have a car, and possibly a special permit put on that car where they can park it. That's just something I'm throwing out there. But that space above the mall should be utilized, and it should be up to the individual owners of those properties to decide whether they want to utilize it or not.
I think there's universal agreement on the mall situation. And in order to facilitate that, I think there needs to be an overlay just for the mall. And then there needs to be some language saying that the use of the second and third floors for residential uses does not require parking. We're not, without defining workforce housing or Airbnb, I mean, it's at least get a start. And I mean, sometimes market forces take care of themselves. If you don't have any employees, you're not making any money. You're shutting down. I don't know.
Yes.
And possibly the way that I think that the mayor stated was to get maybe some sort of a system where the shop owners have an affidavit. They have something stating that these people living here are my employees, that can.
We're slowly pricing ourselves out of a workforce here in Cape May.
We already have.
And yeah,
Cape County.
in many ways we really need to address it. And maybe this is the starting point.
Well, why don't you give Craig and I a chance to do a definition, and part of that definition will also include qualifications, so to speak. And we'll have that for the next event.
Why don't I, if you don't mind, can I throw it out to the Municipal Managers Association? Let me see if I can get something together before we start, rounding around with the professionals. I can get something together through my group, and then I'll bring it back to the board.
Sounds good.
What are you going to bring back, though?
I'll bring back a couple definitions. I'm sure, like you said, other towns, I'm sure, have put together a comprehensive definition for workforce housing. I'll put together a couple definitions that other towns have used, and I'll bring it back to the board for consideration.
If you can not just look at the definition, though, look into the enforcement scheme. You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
How they verify that, how they report it, that would be really cool.
Yeah, I
Or
can do
the-
that.
Or the incentives that they put in place. I mean, the city could benefit from this. We've got problems with city employment because of housing. What kind of incentive can we put in place there? But anyhow, I think housing is, by the way, is number 2 on the list behind parking. It's a serious problem.
All right, so we're leaving it that, Rich, you and Craig are going to.
We're not doing anything.
I'll take a stab at it first. If I can't come up with anything, I'll work with the professionals to get something
Okay.
together to come back.
That's a good plan.
Okay.
We weren't going to solve this in one night.
No, it's a complex issue. I mean, it runs through the rest of the recommendations, too. So the next one is item number 23 on page 13. The same recommendation was made for the C2 district, which is essentially the commercial district that's bound by Beach Avenue, Grant, and Howard. And that's the primary area. And there was a recommendation for the apartments over commercial uses there, too. So it's a little different area. It's not the mall.
I have a question about that.
Sure.
Why just C2? Why not also C3?
So this is the master plan recommendation. So those discussions were held during the drafting of that. So the C1 was recommended, the C2 was recommended separately. In the hierarchy of things, I think the C1 is a much easier lift than the C2. C2 is a little different area, but the rationale is the same. So, we can look at that, but I think the definition of workforce housing is going to be a big driver on what areas we want to see that.
Right.
Now, once again, the theme, I'm going to move to 24, workforce housing. There was a large recommendation in there that was more globally encompassing Cape May as a whole, and there were some unanswered questions in there. So it was more of a recommendation to where can we put this workforce housing? Where can we allow this to be a permitted use? So which zones or areas, what type of housing, are they multifamily, what, are they just apartment units, conversions, what are the economics of this? That was all in there that needed further study. So I think as we start going through this, we're going to come up with some of the answers or not answers and saying that, or maybe we don't find this palatable, I don't know. I don't vote, but I'm here to help you guys. But that was, so the three recommendations in a row all deal with workforce housing. One in the C1, one in the C2, and then more entire Cape May, where can we facilitate this type of use to address the problem that we see? And we've been talking about the problem. We recognize that there's a problem. So I think it might be just a little bit premature to dive into that, and whether we want to set up a subcommittee or something like that to start discussing that as we get into this. I think as we address items number 22 and 23, I think we start setting the stage for dealing with it, number 24.
Well, they're all tied together.
Exactly.
So that's something that the triumvirate, you guys will figure out. All three of those items. Well, figure out's probably not the right word. All right, we'll just move forward past that.
Okay, so number 26 was a recommendation to update our off-street parking standards. Quite frankly, we don't have, all of the permitted uses are not in there. So that's the first thing. The other issue that is brought up during a lot of parking variances is that the planning and engineering standards for parking already have the employees wrapped up into those numbers. But Cape May, the way it's written, is that we do our standard for the commercial use, and then we count the employees after, separately. Most of the modern-day standards for parking, APA or, the ITE, those standards all wrap the employees and customers into one big ball. So it's,
Well, what happens is we end up relying on the applicant saying how many employees are going to have. And we generally know half the time.
no, we get into arguments in front of, at board meetings, I know.
So it might make sense to think about doing not a one-size-fits-all, but combining them together based on whatever these other.
Yeah, so I'm pulling together those planning documents and to try and give some suggestions as how we should modify that, but I don't have that completed yet.
Can you make some type of payroll submission a checklist item? When someone comes in here and says, yeah, I have a hotel and I'm adding, 10 rooms, and we say, and that's going to be one more employee, how many employees they have, and they say 7? I mean, can't you have a checklist item that says they have to provide a payroll list?
We could.
Because I just had this argument with my mother, of all things, because she lives in Ocean City, and they're doing the hotel in Ocean City, and I'm like, they really don't have that many employees at these hotels. They tell us they have, the biggest shift has like 7 employees, and my mother's yelling at me, that's not possible, and she works at the Flanders, and they have this many employees, and she does the payroll for the Flanders, so she has some idea how many employees they really have, and I was like, well, I guess we might not be getting accurate stuff. So it would seem that data's out there, why can't they provide it?
Well, the thing, maybe what Craig's suggestion is that there's already a proven formula that's based on size and anticipated employees that drops them all into
so
one.
the modern data today because they're doing parking counts at, if you're looking at a hotel, they're doing parking counts at a hotel. They're not discerning who's the employee and they're just how many people are coming in and out of that lot. at peak times. And that's how they're deriving the parking calculation.
As long as those formulas include restaurants as part of the hotel and bars as part of the hotel, because I never understand, I never understand it, but, you know, the parking dynamics at the Montreal Inn, or, you know, I'm not picking on them, they're perfectly fine. I'm just saying there's places that have a liquor store, a restaurant, a bar, and 50 hotel rooms, and then we're trying to.
Yeah, what Rich is touching upon is that all these applications that we're hearing where they're trying to justify these parking variances, we're hearing this overlap or, you know, they're saying, oh, well, you know, those guys are biking in or they're not really driving in and they're not, you know, so we're hearing these arguments and it gets very in a gray area. And I think the board members have a hard time wading through that.
Let me ask you a question about that. It's pretty straightforward what we currently require, isn't it?
I'm sorry?
It's pretty straightforward what we require.
So,
A retail store, one parking space for every 200 square feet, one employee on the, one
Largest shift, largest shift.
largest shift.
depends on what, depends, like the mall, so there's different standards for different zones. So some, for hotels, one says on the largest shift and the other ones say the number of employees. So there's different counts depending on what zone and what use you are.
No, but our code,
And our ordinance doesn't take into account the fact that people staying in a motel are going to be going to the restaurant or going to the bar.
Correct.
So
Yeah.
there's logical,
That's the shared parking.
that's an almost unprovable assumption.
that's what Craig is saying. There are proven formulas out there that other municipalities use based on
They're estimations, they're not.
estimation.
Yeah. I think that's,
But they make it
And I
easier.
was questioning if those things really, I don't know how they work. I mean, it's always an estimation.
that's a step backward in specificity. Because we know now that there's one parking space for every 4 seats in a restaurant.
Well, maybe it becomes one space every 3 seats. And then we don't have the employee count.
Well, it seems to me like you're making it less definitive rather than more definitive.
You're basing your definitive on the number of employees, which is always subjective when it gets in front of the board. They just give us a number, and we don't really have an expert that says, I'm not an expert at how many employees are necessary for a 240-seat bar.
So we rely on the applicant for that. But the other thing too in parking, what we don't consider in our current regulations is how many people are standing around a bar on any given Sunday afternoon matinee in a restaurant which is, has X number of seats required by our ordinance, but there's no part of our ordinance that says how many parking spaces are generated by the extra 200 people standing around your bar when your band's playing.
What about the time when the tables aren't all occupied? The reverse is true also. You don't always have to have those spaces all the time.
But you begin with the basis of what you're required to have, even if you're empty. Even if you're empty.
But you're saying you're going to take into account the fact that people are standing around, and now you're going to provide parking for them?
Well, there's other sections of the statute and the ordinance that require occupancy, minimum occupancies by square foot. Couldn't that be the basis for parking requirements?
Then take away the seats.
No, in addition to the seats.
Because you can't do both, Dennis.
Maybe, well, you can do both. You can do both if you have a big enough space in your restaurant to have tables and standing room. I mean, it's just the reality of everything else that happens in the code in terms of square footage. There are other sections of the statutes that do require minimum occupancy by square footage. We can roll that into a parking requirement.
It's maximum by square footage. Maximum by square footage, not minimum.
Yeah, maximum, yeah.
In my almost 10 years here now, on these two boards, and Westkey maybe it's not the same, I don't think making the parking restrictions harder is a useful exercise. because nobody can meet them anyway. There's just isn't the space, everything's built. Like, you can make the parking impossible if you want to. You can require them to have 5,000 parking spaces.
So you're
They
arguing-
don't have the 150 that they need anyway. I mean, I think a better way is to try to make it more efficient, to understand and make them prove
You're arguing down the same road I thought we were all going a minute ago. The first step toward eliminating parking requirements is to waive them for housing above stores in the mall. And if it's so impossible to meet them, let's consider dropping them altogether. That's where you're
What
going.
I'm saying is every.
Well, why bother if you can't meet them?
I've probably seen 20 or 30 different hotel applications since I've been here, and not one of them had more parking than they needed. So your parking regulations are certainly hard enough.
Well, I think the Pier House,
So you're arguing for eliminating them
the
then?
Pier House claimed they did.
You're talking about making it
Not making
harder,
it tougher, not making
addressing
it
it for
right.
people that might be standing around. You could add all those people in, and then, you know, pick a hotel needs 400 more parking spaces. Well, that's fantastic. They don't have the amount required under the current ordinance. I mean, the one they come in.
Yeah, I
they already
understand.
exist.
I understand.
They exist with 130 spaces, and they require 275 in our formula, the ones that come in. So you can make it, that number 450, doesn't matter.
It would help you define the parking problem, though, wouldn't it?
No, not really.
Why not?
Oh, you want to quantify how many
One
spaces
for every
we're
3
short?
seats.
Good luck with that, Dennis.
We're way short. Well, that's why the city doesn't want to do that kind of study, because it's impossible to actually calculate the number of
I don't
spaces.
think, as a taxpayer, I don't want to fund something like that. It's a waste of money.
Yeah,
It's a-
there's not
it's a
enough
win.
land in
It's
the
a
city
win.
to fix it.
All right, so
a win.
basically, this discussion is going in the direction of eliminating parking requirements.
No, but around the mall we're talking about. So far, we're focusing on the mall.
Well, then what about
No,
number
you've
4?
tried to expand it. We're saying let's not expand it. We'll just keep it at the mall right now. You're trying to expand restaurants and
Step one.
have people are standing at. We haven't even,
The journey of 1,000 miles begins with the
well,
first step.
you can philosophize all you want, but we're still just talking about the mall.
Tonight.
The relaxation of parking in the C1 district is proposed to address a greater problem that we see, in my opinion. You're dealing with trying to promote workforce
But
housing
only-
in an area that has zero parking in it, that has available space above storefronts that could be utilized for the type of workforce housing that we're looking for.
But only if you hogtie it to workforce housing.
Only, right, and I think we've evolved the
the
discussion
owners
here
buy
tonight,
into
that is the important
And that's going to
component.
have to be about ordinance.
I just want to say, and don't get mad at me. Taking this parking another step, as a board, many times, we have people come before us, not with commercial, but with housing, and we bend the rules, and where they really should be having 4 parking spaces, they are asking only for 2, and we allow it. I think as a board, we have to rethink that and stop saturating the parking problem more.
I don't recall us, I mean, I'm not trying to be contrarian, but I've sat through, because I'm on the zoning board, so that's where that comes up even more so than here. I don't really remember us granting a variance for inadequate number of parking spaces, never a new construction on a house. It's rare. If you see us grant a variance for parking, there's been no change in the house, so that they had 2 before, they have 2 now, and they need some small variance for something, and they've seen no problem. But the concept that that the zoning board, or this board, is granting variances for new construction houses or expansion of houses and giving parking variances, that's not what I've seen. I've seen many more times where they're adding parking to the application, where they come in, they had 2 existing, and now they're gonna have 4 at the end of this application. That's been my experience, and we have reports at the end of the year on what variances are granted. And we actually looked into this, was it last year, someone who runs for the board called me and asked me this question, and I went through them all, and we hadn't granted a parking variance for a house.
And the reason why is that the residential site improvement standards are what they supersede our ordinance. So we just adopted them because they govern. They're probably not reflective of when you get someone renting out a house and how many vehicles are coming to that rental. You know, if it's a normal residence, you probably don't have a problem. You know, they're probably very reflective of how many vehicles per bedroom are required. But those rentals are where we hear all the complaints.
True.
But there's nothing we can do because the
But I
form
do
of-
recall
the form
sitting
of
on this
ownership-
board and giving people the,
A variance for inadequate parking on new residential construction?
well, there hasn't been a lot of new construction. People coming and doing renovations, and we ask about the bedrooms, and they're short maybe a parking space, and we still have passed it. I'd have to go back in my packets
Yeah,
and
I'd
look.
be interested in seeing that. I don't recall that, but.
There may have
But
been a
just
problem.
moving forward, we should keep that in
It's not as
mind.
bad in Cape May as it is in some other places, is garages. The fallacy that a garage counts as a parking space, because everybody builds a garage and they never put a car in it. That, to me, Ocean City is rampant with that, but here, there's some of that, and we're getting a little more of it now that they're raising houses and trying to put garages under, and they don't really park cars there, but it counts as a parking space.
And the residential site improvements, residential site improvement standards require that you count it.
Yes, that's.
So we
what I think is
we
like.
can't discount those.
Are we allowed to make it more restrictive than RSIS?
What's that?
Are we allowed to make it more
No.
restrictive than RSIS? We're not,
That's
right?
the problem, is that we're stuck.
Where are we here?
Okay, so,
But before we,
We're waiting for you to tell
we
us.
just talked
hey,
about.
Craig, right here.
Okay.
We talked about
Mi-
26.
Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind, I do have a definition already for us to consider on workforce housing. If we want to go back to that real quick, I can read it and we can chew on that. So the state did put out a definition a couple years ago through legislation. And what they came up with was workforce housing means housing affordable to, according to Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development or other recognized standards for home ownership and rental costs, and occupied by or reserved for occupancy by a household with a gross household income equal to more than 80% but less than 120% of the median gross household income for households of the same size within the housing region in which the housing is located, and that may be reserved for occupancy by a household with at least one member working or living in the municipality upon submittal of the application for workforce housing.
Yeah,
That's-
I was looking at that too. That's really not what you guys have in mind, I don't think. But you're trying to find something that they don't call affordable housing. That's
It's
not like for
seasonal.
Working families. You're looking more like for seasonal employee housing kind of thing, not tied
Right.
to income, but tied to.
The definition
local
should be
businesses.
more related to your ties to employment within the city of Cape May.
Okay, well,
Not weekly or.
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, because I saw the same thing, because there's actually legislation that just passed about certain benefits you can get and loans you can get through workforce housing.
Right.
That's more affordable housing.
Yeah, yes,
Okay.
working family housing.
Figured I would give it a stab since we were all here.
Yeah, no, I was cheating too, I was flicking through this one.
Okay.
We're number 24.
Okay.
We're 27, aren't we?
Yeah, I just touched upon
We're past that.
number 26, and we just had a little discussion with regards to that, so we'll evolve that concept. Item number 27 is the parking trust account. And there was a recommendation. Parking trust account, the current parking trust zoning regulations are as follows, and that's all in the italic on page 15. The recommendation is contributions to the parking trust account have been infrequent over the past 10 years due to the fact that the contribution may only be collected for the conversion of existing buildings, and that may be a deterrent and not an incentive to development. Revising this section to allow for a more liberal application and allowance of the contribution in lieu of variances has been discussed in the past to potentially generate funds to target improvements to the city's parking infrastructure. It is now recommended that the above provision for the parking trust fund be eliminated. So we discussed this back when we were doing the re-exam, and the consensus is that we eliminate the parking trust fund, because it really isn't being used at all.
I can tell you that the genesis of that trust fund was back in the 80s, when a lot of larger houses were being converted to B&Bs, and the B&Bs did not have any parking. So you couldn't buy your way to it. You couldn't say, I'll just give money to the city, and automatically I'll get 6 rental rooms. It was something that kicked in once they got permission,
Once they got the
variances, and so that was pretty much it. And I don't know how much is in that fund now. Mike, do you remember how much was in
No,
it?
not much.
No? Do you know how much is in the fund?
I don't, but I can report
Okay,
back for
okay.
the next meeting.
It's,
Probably a couple $100,000, I would think.
it's, yeah, probably less than that. It also is the repository for the parking assessment, mercantile license parking assessment. It's also used to house
That's
that.
not how it's defined.
And I understand that, but that's what the city's using it for right now. So that, the amount of funds in it is going to be generated both by the original assessments, which are no longer viable, and the annual parking assessment collected from mercantile licenses.
So where does the parking assessment come from?
It's in the ordinances, it's attached to every mercantile license to assist the city, $25 to assist the city in parking
Every
solutions.
mercantile license pays $25.
Yeah.
And that's all deposited in this.
That's put in that account.
Well, back to this section here. It has this parking trust fund has not been utilized.
Mr. Chairman, can I just jump in on it, just a quick? I think we did use some of these funds, for example, on the parking lot at the Welcome Center, the bus depot.
Right.
We could use these funds at the Lafayette Street Park surface parking lot that were, in fact, some good news was we finally got I forgot how many letters are in the acronym for the PPCRD letter or whatever from JCP&L. But bottom line is, we could now proceed with the land, taking the land over from JCP&L for Lafayette Street Park. We just got that letter last week. They also cut us a check for $270,000 for the park. Sorry, not to get off on that. Bottom line is, we will be building a parking lot to some degree on that property. Frankly, we would use some of these funds if we had to, if we ran out of it. So I just say that we probably haven't used it in a while, but we did use it on the Welcome Center. We would use it at Lafayette Street Park, and perhaps in the future. I'm not trying to sway people one way or the other. I just think we haven't been doing a lot of parking projects in a long time.
And if I could just piggyback off that, Mayor, I would recommend against eliminating the parking trust fund at this time, just based off of, we don't really know how the city's going to completely evolve over the next couple of years, and maybe there is a need, and we do need to tap into that to resurface a parking lot or build one or do something that we, normally wouldn't have the funds to devote towards that. So I would recommend not eliminating it at this time.
Well, Mr.
So this is for conversions of existing buildings
Correct.
solely.
That's why it's not being used, really.
That's right.
I don't recall an application using it. I remember Monzo came in once and sort of talked about it, and then I don't know if they did it. I haven't seen one.
No, it was a one-time deal. Like Bill said, most of these conversions happened early on. The money was put in the fund. It's been sitting there. The only time it's been added to is when the city used it to save the parking assessment, but it hasn't been used. That's not the reason to eliminate it. The discussion that was taking place in the master plan in 2019 seemed to indicate that it still had a viability if you changed its mission,
Right.
if you broadened its catchment.
Revise the use.
So let's,
The problem with the use is under 52549E, number 1, contributions to the city parking trust account shall be permitted only for the conversion of buildings in existence as of the effective date of the establishment of the city parking trust account. In the event that an application for development constitutes an addition to an existing building or the construction of a new building, the parking requirements of subsection C must be met and no contribution to the city parking trust account will be permitted.
yeah, so
So most applications that we're seeing, it's not permitted,
correct.
contribution.
And
Contemplate convert what to what? What
It was, the whole reason was for the to protect the B and Bs,
Correct.
to allow the conversions for B and Bs. That was the intent of
From
it,
what to what?
Single family to
from
B-
single families to B and Bs.
Oh, that's why we haven't seen many.
Right, exactly. So that's not happening anymore. So if you want, I don't, like, and I think this discussion was had, during the re-exam process, but, part of the discussion was, do we want to broaden this to allow more contributions?
right, remove the impediment
Right.
that makes it useless.
Exactly. So that's why I brought it up, is like, this is not being utilized at all.
I think, just personally, I agree with you, but the recommendation should not be to get rid of it. The
Well, the
recommendation should...
consensus at that time was to get rid of it. I
Right.
mean, I don't write what
I
you
understand,
guys don't want.
I get you, relax, I understand that. But let's consider a recommendation to remove that impediment, which you mentioned there, limiting it so much that it's useless, and broaden its use and start using it. That to me sounds like a more constructive
You're gonna say
recommendation.
that'll let people do the thing that you're worried about, which is they will be able to do development without having parking. They will just dump some money in this thing and.
Which is just as good as consistently granting getting variances for no parking spaces. At least we're getting some revenue
But you-
to help the
variance-
city fund.
Variance, you have the opportunity to say no, this you can't say no to. So if they want to do it and they have the money, they can just not.
Well, the way this is written is, it says you have to get the variance and then you're allowed to contribute.
Well, then you have to. It's,
Yeah.
it supposedly puts the.
So
cart before the horse.
theoretically, the board could deny the variance, but
That sounds arbitrary.
it's a little clunky.
Well,
It's a lot of clunky.
It's 25 years old.
Right, so, but,
Yep.
Well,
Well, let's go, let's just continue real briefly with what Dennis is saying. Is it, you throw this out, but you rewrite it to the extent that if anybody gets a parking variance for any conversion, new construction, whatever, that there's a contribution for every spot that's deficient.
yeah.
Can I ask, when was this $5,000 number written before? When was the $5,000 number
25 years ago.
named?
yeah.
So maybe it should be a higher number.
Well, no,
Just saying.
you're never going to
Can't help
find a
it.
property that's going to want to do what this thing helps them do, because nobody's converting to be,
It's going the other way around.
it's going the other way around. So, and the other problem with this was a one-time deal. So they gave this much money 25 years ago, they've never given anything else. There's never been an annual, so,
No, that was never intended to be that.
right, I know. I'm just saying what it is.
Correct.
I understand its purpose when you're trying to deal with the specific conversion thing, but when you just start equating variances with money, there's something about that that makes me just feel weird. So if you're broke and you want a parking variance,
You don't get it.
but if a big hotel comes in and is 30 spots short and they want to dump 150 grand in, they're going to get a leg up on a variance, I guess that's okay, but
No.
doesn't sound like what this was designed for.
At least it's an
Well,
acknowledgement.
This was designed because some of the first guys that were in with B and Bs saw all this new competition coming in. There was actually an attempt to try and discourage
Right.
more B and Bs. And I'm not gonna name names, but it was, they were afraid of more and more competition, their business was going down. So that's,
And to your point, Rich, at least it's an acknowledgement of the responsibility of the applicant to address the issue of parking in a productive way for the city.
I understand. That's okay.
Yeah. Well,
Mr. Chairman, we have 20 minutes until 8 PM. I think fencing may be a little easier. Is that the next one?
Fencing? Yeah.
yeah, I mean, we don't
By the
have-
way, I
we
appreciate
don't
the
have
hard
to-
stop. I
We don't have
appreciate
to
that.
solve all these things. These are
right.
What?
We don't have. we
I'm
don't
kidding,
have
it's a joke. I'm
to
kidding.
Solve all these things. If we discuss them and they're still hanging out there, so be it. We can,
Okay.
there's some things we can take care of and some we can't.
all right, so number 29 is on the last page. So this deals with the definition of fencing and and the controls for fencing. And the recommendation is clarification should be provided as to rear. Rear should be clarified to indicate rearward of the principal structure. 6-foot-high fences in the side yards could potentially negatively impact views in historic neighborhoods and should not be permitted. So this was whether the rear was the rear yard or rear yard setback or the rear of the structure. And I believe during the reexamination, we, the board, thought it should be to the rearward of the principal structure. So you can have 6-foot-high fence to the back face of your structure, but forward of that, it has to be 4 foot or less. And then
Even though I don't agree with that, I'm not gonna think about it. I mean, what's wrong with the front of the house and going back?
I'm not a policymaker, I'm just carrying out what the board
was discussed.
recommended.
What was the question?
If the rear yard would start at the front of the house, from the front line of the house and going back, instead of the
You're-
back of the house.
I mean, your point is, what's wrong with the 6-foot fence, or
No,
what?
not the fence,
You didn't say the word fencing, you said,
I meant fencing.
re-say what you said. You said about with your rear yard setback and confusing, just start over what you said.
The rear yard would start where the front of the house is as opposed to the back of the house.
Okay.
So that your side yard, the side yards would have a 6-foot fence there. That's my
Okay.
contention. And, just, Bob?
Yeah, I was just, I mean, I had to apply that criteria when I had a fence installed at my house. And the way they defined the 4 foot was to where the original structure ended in the backyard. I have an addition behind that had been added on like 25, 30 years later or something like that. So I had 4 foot up to what was the end of the original house, and then I could go 6 feet from that point on. And to me, it was straightforward. It made sense to me the way I was going to do it anyway.
Well, that's going to be a hard one to,
It was about 15, probably 10, 12 years ago, too.
Does this say anything about corners?
well, corner lot, you've got 2 front yards.
Here's the house.
So you can't have a 6-foot front fence on a corner.
Over here.
Well, the ordinance allows you to choose your rear yard in that case. You have
Okay.
one side and one rear.
Okay?
So you're allowed to choose it, and then that would be the rear face of your principal structure, and then you would be allowed to have a 6-foot fence.
But on both street frontages, they're only 4 feet.
Correct.
Yeah. I think that's back to I just,
We've had variance applications for pools on corner lots for those.
see, so is there any reason why 6-foot fence can't start at the front of the house, running down the side all the way to the back? It's not a site triangle issue.
It's saying it's an aesthetic thing.
Pardon me?
I mean, based on what the discussion, it's an aesthetic issue.
I guess.
Yeah.
It's not a safety issue.
No.
No, it's more of a streetscape.
Right.
If you're walking down the street and the 6-foot fences start protruding out further than what they were intended to.
And the neighbor can have their view obstructed by a 6-foot fence as well.
Light air and open space, yeah.
Yeah, I'm fine with that.
To me, it's straightforward.
So it was just, if I recall correctly, the zoning officer requested this clarification be made so that it was clear for applicants, so that they weren't coming in and getting bounced back and forth because of the unclarity of it. So I recommended changing the language. And fences, so the last sentence is the only change. Fences may be constructed to 6 feet in height when located and to the rear of the principal structure. So right now it says fences may be constructed to 6-foot height when located in the rear, period. So the clarification is just to the rear of the principal
Well, if you
structure.
go back to Bob's illustration of his house, he's got an addition on the back of his original house, but his fence was allowed to start at the back of the original house and not the addition.
I wouldn't have put a fence in then because you'd have 4 feet and then 6 feet for the last, probably 20% of the backyard, and that would have been it. Wouldn't have made, even from the visual perspective, it wouldn't have looked right.
Right.
Mr. Chairman, I remember we had the discussion on finished attic space, I think it was, that came from a recommendation from the code enforcement, I guess. Is that right?
Yeah.
Do you think to finalize some of these, just having him come to the meeting and explain some of those might make sense? Or did we get beyond the attic space thing already, and I'm bringing up an old one?
No, I think we addressed some of that last month, but I wasn't going to start rewriting all of these until we got through these, and then I was going to start.
Okay.
Because there were recommendations made last meeting, this meeting, so.
on page 3.
This thing I get. He wants to know whether you start from the
Right.
back of the house
Right.
or the front of the house.
So
That's,
I did have a
wants
conversation.
clarification on that.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and I did have a conversation with Bruce today briefly about the attic space and kind of that living situation. So, I mean, if you want me to comment, I can, or if we want him to come to a future work session, we can do that too.
Maybe I'd go with what we were doing. I apologize, I forgot that you were going to come back with those recommendations to the board, and then if we had any questions.
I think I misunderstood your comment. But I do, when I craft these, I send these to the zoning officer and let him comment. I did receive some comment back from him last time, and I incorporated it into our comments last time. So I'm not doing this in a vacuum. You know, he's very essential to this process.
Perfect.
And Mayor, so you know, since coming on to the planning board, I've had an active conversation with Bruce and trying to create that dialogue, so when I do come to the meetings, we have some background on what we're talking about.
Perfect.
Does anybody have a preference for the fencing? If we start from the front of the house and go back, and then you know where it is?
Yeah, I believe that it's being interpreted this way. We're just trying to clarify the language in the ordinance.
Right.
That's, so I don't think we're changing anything.
Right. Yeah, I think it's fine.
Okay, so from the front of the house, great.
Okay. The last one, item number 33. So to maximize potential parking spaces within the city, off-street parking standards should be revised to clarify no limit to the stacking of parking spaces for dwelling uses only. Section 525-59E, back-out parking should not be permitted for commercial uses and clarified as such. Parking in lawns should be expressly prohibited and enforced. The city currently allows on-street parking in driveway curb cut areas by permit for dwellings where the owner entirely controls the driveway. To address parking shortages in the city, these types of spaces are relatively unknown and should be publicized, promoted, and possibly permitted to count towards off-street parking requirements. So that right now, if you have a parking space in the mouth of your driveway, it's really not counting. So we've recommended to clarify that. The following is recommended to change section 525-60E8. Off-street parking shall be limited to approved areas. And then this is new language. Back-out parking is permitted for residential uses from permitted residential driveways. Back-out parking onto public streets and alleys is not permitted for non-residential uses. On-street parking in the driveway curb cut area allowed by city permit may count towards the required on-site parking requirements.
And the property owner pays a fee for that. Right.
So, very simple.
Yep.
It incorporates all the recommendations.
Okay. So
So what if they don't have a permit for that? What would happen?
Doesn't count.
They just get ticketed? I mean, I thought driveways were, you know, you would have to call someone to,
well, the owner's not going to call on himself.
no, I know, right, right. No, exactly, but so if there's a car parked there and it's not permitted, who's to,
It becomes an enforcement issue.
Yeah.
It's just
Okay.
no other, just like a regular parking.
right.
It also could come up in front of the planning board if they're at,
But then
Applying
remember,
for-
this is in the zoning ordinance, so this is more for people that are coming in to get applications approved or submit for a building permit and comply with the ordinance. So it effectively makes it easier on the applicant to comply.
Got it.
Vicky?
So when you can park in front of your driveway cutout, there's no minimum that says you have to have so much space to be able to do that? You know what I mean? Like some driveways are narrow.
Yeah, there's nothing that says that.
There should be something that says like has to be like at least the minimum space of a parking spot. Because otherwise, somebody could park in there and mess up the parking on the rest of the block. if it's not
I
big
thought there was a minimum dimension.
We have a
that was
minimum parking
required.
space defined elsewhere in the ordinance, so.
Know what I mean?
Yeah.
But that should say, if you're going to do that, your driveway cutout should meet a minimum parking spot. Because if
Okay.
you have a narrow driveway,
That's 18 feet.
yeah, whatever it is.
Right.
Your normal driveway is like 16, so with the lines, you should have plenty of room, right? Sorry.
With what line?
Well, you know, when your driveway's marked as, you can't, not a parking spot, there should be 18 feet there.
But if they have a permit to park there.
The size of a
they-
parking spot,
I
yeah.
don't
They-
think
they
that
have to mark it
driveways
out.
are 18 feet wide.
Yeah,
No, but when they mark them, you don't go right to the edge of it, you give them a couple feet on each side of it.
Who marks it?
the DPW, I
They painted
believe-
yellow, right?
Yeah, Department of Public Works would paint the yellow as part of the permit process.
Okay.
And I think part of it is actually just that turning radius coming at, of course, you're not going to have the parking right up on each side of the driveway. There's a little
Right.
give,
There's a
yeah.
Yeah, there is.
The wings.
Well, we have, I believe that we've denied some of the requests for permits for that because they did not have the adequate space. Yeah.
So you want, 18 feet, Craig?
Yeah, I'm gonna call it out as meeting the minimum parking width, which is defined elsewhere in the ordinance.
Parking length.
Length, you're right.
Can a person who's renting use that?
I don't see why not.
I just remember hearing if
Well,
you,
is the permit transferable
yeah, that's my
in
question.
that sense? Yeah,
Well, it's meant for the occupant of the house.
okay, yeah.
Yeah. And if anybody else parks there, the occupant of the house calls the cops.
Right, that's why it's effective, is because it's controlled by the homeowner.
Yes.
We've had those impossible questions enter our office where people have a situation and it gets almost impossible. Because
This-
they say, I can't do this, I can't do that, and
This says the owner controls the driveway, not the occupant.
Well, the owner's controlling it by letting his tenant use it. That would be my argument.
Dennis, what do you think?
I like it.
All right, let's go.
Of course he does.
So we have a few things that we addressed, there's still a few hanging out there.
We have to evolve some of these recommendations, so we'll work on that. There's some definitions to work on, Barclay standards to get you.
Yep.
Okay.
Well, this is helpful.
Yeah.
Baby steps.
Listen, we made,
It's 5 of 8.
we made the deadline. Get a motion?
Motion.
Second?
Motion adjourned.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Okay, happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving, yep.
What's on, hey, Bill? What's on at 8 o'clock?
Once you get a see view.